UN's only response to these corruption cases, now two, has been to throw inner city press out and continue to restrict it. Today, even censoring it as it tries to cover the new Secretary General Antonio Guterres praising Egyptian strongman al-Sisi. But today, the story is corruption. We'll do a Periscope after the sentencing. This afternoon, Jeffrey Yin, who was the personal assistant of Ng Lap Seng, the businessman who was recently convicted on six counts of bribery of the UNPGA and others in the UN system, is set for sentencing. And so it's a time that I'd like to ask you: does the UN feel or is there anything more that it's going to be doing as this case? Mr. Ng Lap Seng is going to be sentenced as well, and he was found guilty. Given these guilty pleas, and there's another case coming down the pike, what steps has anyone in the UN system been actually held accountable for what the jury found were bribes paid in the UN?
I think those who have committed crimes were clearly held accountable in court. Thank you.
Okay, here we are, down in Foley Square. We covered the first UN bribery trial here last summer. Throughout the summer, Ng Lap Seng was found guilty of 6 counts of bribery inside the United Nations of then President of the General Assembly, John Ash, may he rest in peace, but others who faced no accountability at all. Today, his assistant, Jeffrey Yin, will be sentenced. We used to cover Ng Lap Seng getting into his black car with his private security right here. He's still out of jail despite the conviction. And there's a second UN bribery case involving Patrick Ho and the China Energy Fund Committee. But we're going in for this sentencing right now here at the courthouse. The UN, we can say, is entirely corrupt. The UN's only response to these corruption cases, now two, has been to throw inner city press out and continue to restrict it. Today, even censoring it as it tries to cover the new Secretary General Antonio Guterres praising Egyptian strongman al-Sisi. But today, the story is corruption. We'll do a Periscope after the sentencing. In front of the federal courthouse, it was a more than 2-hour sentencing proceeding for Jeffrey Yin. He was the personal assistant of Ng Lap Seng, convicted for UN bribery in a trial this summer that we covered. The UN, of course, has cleaned up nothing. In the trial, it was said, let me check it out, it went on and on, on and on. In fact, even after the sentence was imposed by Judge Broderick, who also, by the way, has let Ng Lap Seng live in his apartment on 47th Street, even after conviction. Once he imposed a sentence of 7 months, the public defender, quite effectively, said that the next step would be to argue for the halfway house. Basically, she painted a picture of Jeffrey Yin as filial piety, that he did what he did because Ng Lap Seng ordered it. Ng Lap Seng said, wire this money to Terra Trading in the Dominican Republic for Francis Lorenzo, and he did it not questioning whether the money was in exchange for any work or was just a way to pay bribes. The prosecution made it clear, and the defense, at least for Mr. Yin, did not dispute that the scheme overall was to purchase decisions falsely from the United Nations. And the prosecution, and it should follow up on that, referred to others whose decision-making was influenced. They cited Lorenzo. They cited John Ash, now dead. They cited the payments of money. Now, here's a fact. Having covered the trial, when Terra Trading couldn't get the money released because it was dubious money, a letter was written to the Dominican banking authorities by then El Salvador ambassador Carlos Garcia, still a player in the UN in the sustainable development world. You see, the UN did nothing. They didn't follow the trial. In the second UN bribery case involving Patrick Ho and the China Energy Fund Committee, they haven't even done an audit. In fact, China Energy Fund Committee is still accredited to the UN Economic and Social Council, often spoken to by Amina J. Mohammed and Antonio Guterres. They've allowed corruption to flourish among their multi-programmed, multi-lettered, acronym-based, fraudulent. Well, that's to the side. So Mr. Yin, it was described, has a father who's incarcerated in China, and for that I'm sympathetic. Apparently, Jeffrey Yin's father, unlike Mr. Ng Lap Seng, who's widely described as being part of the government, Mr. Jeffrey Yin's father was incarcerated by the government for losing some party officials' money, according to what was said inside. And so Mr. Yin, having gotten a Bachelor of Arts from University of California, and worked for a year for Deloitte and Touche, if that's still what they're called, moved to China to be, and at some point to Hong Kong, to be near his father and his elderly grandparents. Somehow in that time, Mr. Jeffrey Yin became an employee of Ng Lap Seng, the Macau-based billionaire / government official, of his son, and he was poached. That's how the defense portrayed it. He was poached as a translator / money wirer. Now, the dispute became whether Jeffrey Yin was just an innocent pawn of Ng Lap Seng, who the defense, in this case, here's the irony. The defense lawyer for Jeffrey Yin said Ng Lap Seng is a billionaire, he does whatever he wants, he's an asshole. She didn't use that word, although she almost did. Many times she told Mr. Richenthal to sit himself down and stop talking. But she described Mr. Ng Lap Seng in a certain way, and one of the lawyers sitting in the first row right behind him was Ng Lap Seng's lawyer, was one of his massive team of lawyers. So it was ironic. The question being, what's the connection anymore between Mr. Ng Lap Seng, still living large on 47th Street, and Mr. Jeffrey Yin? We don't know. We don't know. The sun is setting here on Foley Square. What we can say is that the UN corruption continues unabated. If anything, more corrupt than before. Because nothing has been cleaned up. Nothing has been audited. The cases come one after another. One NGO after another, paying bribes inside the United Nations. And meanwhile, you have a judge, well, again, it is the system. It is the system, and the defense lawyer was highly, I'm telling you, this is a federal defense lawyer you've got to have. Because even when you lose, the judge says, well, here's what I'm proposing. He's not proposing. You just ruled. That's what Mr. Richenthal, the prosecutor, said. He's also the prosecutor in the case of Patrick Coe and Sheikh Gadio, and what he ought to do is to make sure that the UN, the actual basis, the breeding ground, the petri dish of these various corruption cases, does more than just create more cases. Unless, of course, the goal is just to have more and more work for the corruptos. So Jeffrey Yin was described by the prosecution, Mr. Jeffrey Yin, as having been arrested with $15,000 in his flight bag and staying in the Waldorf Astoria and convening a flotilla of black cars to go to a casino. Now, the defense lawyer said, yeah, he was working hard. He's working real hard. This guy's working it, paying bribes to Francis Lorenzo and to John Ash to procure decision-making inside the United Nations. It's shameful. And it's shameful that the UN, no one else from the UN press corps, of course not, let them have their offices, for covering this case. Ng Lap Seng, described without exception in today's proceedings as the UN briber, through his South-South News, a bribery vehicle, nobody disputes it, paid $50,000 to the UN Correspondents Association and obtained a photo op with the Secretary General. Inner City Press wanted to cover their meeting, which was held in the UN press briefing room. We went to cover it. The spokesman was brought in to tell us to leave. We said, well, if you've got some paperwork, we're out of here. Is it a closed meeting? It's in the press briefing room. He said, I want you to leave. He said, if you can show some paperwork, or a security officer asks, we're going to go. A security guard came and said, he doesn't have any paperwork, he wants you to go. And we left. Well, they used that as the pretext to evict Inner City Press from its workspace, award the workspace to a no-show Egyptian state media that works for Al-Sisi, who Guterres sent his warm regards to today while ordering Inner City Press to stop recording. Sani Yusuf is the name of the journalist, never comes in, and continues to restrict Inner City Press to this day. There's been a second case. The UN is so corrupt, once was not enough. Nothing was learned. And in fact, at least South News was belatedly acted on. China Energy Fund Committee, perhaps because it's so close to the government, is still accredited to the Economic and Social Council, where Amina J. Mohammed and Antonio Guterres spoke only this week in an entirely unreformed United Nations. As to Mr. Yin, the judge concluded by saying, I don't want to see you again, which is a classic judge speak. He said, once you're released, and he even said, once you're released either from the prisons or from the halfway house, I don't want to see you again. And so, anyway, we've got to go back up to the UN because we actually have a censorship deadline up there. If we don't get back in, we came back up to our computer, which is digesting and ingesting video from today's proceeding where we asked the UN spokesman, any comment on this case? No comment on this case. He said the only people guilty are the people in court. No, the UN has immunity, and that's why they continue taking bribes, generating corruption cases, which are then turned into a mockery years later downtown and throwing journalists in the street. The UN is corrupt. To be continued.